Okay, hi everyone, my name is Dr. Ewan Kirkland. My area of research is children's media. I did my PhD on children's movies, which was a kind of problematic area to research because as soon as I started researching films for children I realised there actually weren't any. Most theatrical release films aren't made for children. I've subsequently kind of expanded that. I'm currently writing a book about children's media and modernity, where I'm looking at children's literature, children's films, very problematically defined, children's TV and children's digital media, thinking about the connections between all these different kinds of culture, so the recurring themes, but also the way in which these media relate to ideas about childhood and modernity, and I'm finding some very interesting kind of parallels and interesting kind of things going on in relation to the kind of history of these various media and their relationship with children. One of the things I'm really interested in as an academic is the relationship between children's culture and merchandise. One of the ways in which I was writing about children's films, because as I said, films aren't made for children, they're made for, generally speaking, made for a broad audience. One of the ways which I found it as very useful thinking about how we can define media for children is the relationship between merchandise. So for example, we've got two examples here. This is from My Little Pony, which is very clearly a children's form of children's culture. It's very clearly kind of aimed at kids. But then we've also got these toys which are for Battlestar Galactica, and I don't know if anyone's familiar with Battlestar Galactica, but it's not really a children's film, but a children's show. But there we have what looks like an object of childhood. So it's kind of problematic thinking about the relationship between, just because an object looks like a toy doesn't necessarily mean that it's a toy for kids. One of the ways in which I have worked through this is thinking about clothing. Clothing is a really useful way of thinking about how different franchises are aimed at different audiences. So, for example, the fact that we have ties with Simpsons characters on them suggests that there is partly a market for adults buying those kind of clothes. Similarly, here we have this is an adult-sized My Little Pony T-shirt. But then we also have, I've rated these from my kids' clothes, Star Wars pyjamas, which are this is very clearly a kid's article of clothing, just by the size of it. And here we have, anyone's familiar with Angry Birds, but again, like this shows that there is clearly a kind of market, or at least these franchises are in some way being directed towards children. So I found out that merchandise is a very useful way of kind of unpicking the relationship between children and screen media, which is very complicated. The thing which I'm talking about today, and I'm going to circulate these amongst you, I do use a lot of kind of material culture in the teaching that I'm doing. These are, anyone who's familiar with these, Toys to Life is effectively it's a new kind of, it's not really a franchise, it's more a kind of brand of video game that's emerged over the last few years. The way that these games work is you have a disc, you have a kind of video game disc which you put in your console. But in order to play the game, you need an avatar. You need to have something to play as. And what you get is you get these little. I've got some more here. These little figurines. You put them on a platform which is connected to your PlayStation or your Xbox, and then the figure that's represented by the figurine then magically transforms into an avatar on the screen that you can then play as. And the idea is that you don't just buy one of these, you buy a whole collection. These are as you can see, there's a carrying case for these. So there's obviously the implication is that you don't just buy one, you buy a whole load. There's a number of various versions of this. The first one was Skylander, which came out in 2011, based on the Spyro the Dragon series. So this is the one which started it all off. Nintendo, as you can see here, also brought out a Amiibo range, which is compatible with a couple of games, which actually can be played without these. So these are kind of add-ons, but you can see some of the franchises. We've got kind of Princess Peach, that's a Me, we've got Kirby. And this one is really interesting. It looks like it's made out of fabric, and it actually is. This is one which is a kind of fabric Amiibo, which is again is really interesting in terms of children's culture, because of course the plushie is very much associated with children. You place these figures on your DS or on your Wii U pad, and they they transform into the game. Lego Dimensions is the most recent one, 2015, and this is, you can see there's this really interesting kind of mashup of different genres going on here. We've got obviously characters from the Lego movies, but then that's Doctor Who. We've got Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. In the middle is the Batmobile. We've got a Ghostbuster, and in the bottom right-hand corner is a character from Portal. I don't know how many people are familiar with Portal. It was actually started off as a video game. Was released in 2007. There's a sequel a few years after that, and now there's a range of Portal Legos, and now Portal Lego has been transformed into Lego Dimensions. So there's a really interesting kind of like interplay between different kinds of franchises, different kinds of media. Disney Infinity is the one which I'm mainly focusing on in my research at the moment. This started it kind of straddles this whole kind of period. So the first one came out in 2013, which featured Disney and Pixar characters. So you've got Sadness there and Maleficent there. 2014, they brought out a series which were based around Marvel characters, and in 2015, they released a whole series based on Star Wars. And obviously, this is a reflection of the range of intellectual properties that the Disney studio currently holds. These are images that I took from Game in Churchill Square. You can see the amount of space which is being taken up by these various brands. We've got the Skylander, that's the Amiibo range. There's really, I don't know if you can actually see it. That's a figure of Mario as a kind of pixelated figure. So there's some really interesting kind of thing going on there in terms of representation. And in terms of the transfer of a figure from a video game into an object. That's a slightly blurry image of the kind of Lego Dimensions and various kind of Disney ones. We've got Mulan there and characters from Inside Out and so on. So hopefully you can see there's the whole range of different kind of issues which are kind of being brought up here in terms of kind of convergence, transmedia storytelling, remediation, the relationship between different kinds of media, fan culture as well. I think in particular we're looking at Lego Dimensions. The idea of Lego Dimensions is that all these different characters from different franchises are playing together in this kind of digital space. So it seems to be a reflection of what fan culture has been doing for a long time, which is bringing different characters from different stories together. There's also issues of ludification. I mean, this is something which I'm also quite interested in because I've done a lot of work on video games. But one of the ways in which merchandising works is the transformation of toys and objects into games. So I've got kind of versions of Top Trumps, which is probably one of the most well-known ones, and it's a kind of Adventure Time board game. So there is something going on as well about kind of like games and play happening here, which obviously kind of relates to children's culture, play being something which has always been kind of associated with children. But also the kind of what various writers have called the kind of ludification of culture, which is a term which has yet to be really properly defined, but it is something which has been identified as a cultural trend. We've also got issues of merchandising. Some very useful definitions here about the difference between merchandise, tie-ins, product placement. One of the things which you're seeing here is, in fact, all these different aspects collapsing together. So when you have a film which comes out where the toys have actually been on sale for several years, you ask, is this merchandise or is this a kind of tie-in? If you go and see Toy Story and it's got Buzz Lightyear as a character in the film, and you can then go and buy that in the store, is that more product placement than it is a kind of a traditional sense of merchandising? Various writers have kind of talked about the relationship between toys and media. Alan's coins the term toyetic, arguing that films, but also TV shows, are increasingly being organised around how well they can sell different characters as toys. One example I think that's really striking is the Minions. Minions as a character that's been created now have their own movie. This translates very easily into a toy. There's only two colours. It's just the right shape to kind of not be knocked over. There's another, the Star Wars franchise is another kind of example which is used when Return of the Jedi came out. The first scene, the Jabba the Hutt scene, seems to be a very good example of kind of like just putting all these different creatures on the screen so they can be translated into action figures. So that's one of the things which we see going on within popular culture. This is something I've recently encountered. Michael Saylor and his idea of re-enchantment. This is something which I'm trying to kind of apply to some of my discussions of children's media. He picks up on this argument that in modern society there's this kind of sense of disenchantment, we've lost our connection with kind of spiritualism and magic and wonder, and what we see is an attempt to kind of inject that into culture, particularly into, he's looking at literature, but we can see the kind of modern fascination with magic, fantasy, nonsense as a reaction to this kind of disenchantment within popular culture. And one of the interesting things I think is the way in which the child quite often features as a figure for this re-enchantment to take place. So a really good example is the Harry Potter series, which was read not just by children, by lots of adults. And we can think about how Harry Potter maybe kind of functions in relation to this. And there are kind of Lego Harry Potters there, as you can see. And this kind of sense of re-enchantment, I think, is going on in the kind of technology we've got here. And we've got a number of images. Clearly there is a sense of something magic happening in this kind of promotional image of the amoeba. This idea that you put this figure on the plinth and it magically appears on the screen. And here's another one this is from Lego Dimensions, which kind of again emphasises the kind of mash-up culture that's going on here. We've got there's Batman in the mystery machine. We've got Gandalf on a hoverboard and so on. But there is this sense of there's this magic portal which opens up where all these different characters can kind of emerge. And of course Disney makes it's probably kind of like based its entire fortunes on this idea of re-enchantment, of kind of like adding a kind of sense of magic to what is basically kind of mass-produced films, mass-produced objects. Lash and Lurie in their book Global Culture Industries uses the term Mediaspace to describe this process whereby things are becoming media and media are becoming things. There's this kind of crossover between different forms of culture. I mean, one example I've got here is this is a Boba Fett character. If you squeeze him, he says something, and the question is this a piece of media? Because this is a piece of dialogue. You probably can't hear it.
As you wish. He's no good to me dead.
This is a piece of dialogue from the actual movie. So the question is this a piece of media? Well, I would argue it kind of is, kind of not. But either way, we've got this kind of like connection between media becoming objects and objects being remediated into various kind of forms of screen culture. They usually say transposition, translation, transmogrification, transformation, suggesting there's almost this kind of magical process. And they talk about the way in which cultural entities themselves become reflexive in their self-modification over a range of territories, a range of environments. And although they're not talking particularly about children's culture, two examples they do talk about the Wallace and Gromit series and Toy Story, which in many ways, Toy Story is for talking about these kind of trends is a really good example because it's the first entirely digitally produced feature film, and it actually is about toys. And I'm sure most of you know that the Buzz Lightyear toy was incredibly successful. I would argue because he's made to be a great toy within the film itself. So although it's not entirely a cynical process, you can see how the production of a film entirely based around toys by a corporation is very much into kind of merchandising stuff, works very well. And of course, children's culture has been doing this kind of mediaification of things for a very long time. Here's some kind of examples. This is in the 1950s. Nintendo, before it started making video games, had a very lucrative license with Disney and started producing cards with Disney characters on them. We've got the Barbie series. I don't know how many of you have been lucky enough to watch any of the Barbie straight-to-DVD films, which are all kind of like feature Barbie as a character in Rapunzel and the Snow Princess and a whole range of different movies. There's also another version of Barbie called Barbie Life in the Dream House, which is much more kind of ironic, postmodern take on kind of like the transformation of this doll into a character within a film, or within a, I'm not even sure if it's a film because it's, as I said, it's straight to DVD, so it's all between that kind of like feature film and television. Pokemon, a really good example. Of course, Pokemon started off as a video game in the late 1990s and became this huge phenomenon, including toys, but also there's the card games and a whole range of different kind of like products based around Pokemon. Ever After High, I don't really have time to talk about that, and there's Teletubbies there. One of the things which I'm also interested in is the way in which children are encouraged to dress up as characters from films and TV shows. Obviously, adults do that. We call it cosplay. But children are encouraged by Disney to dress up as the characters in their films. If you go to the Disney website, you can see lots of kind of like examples of costumes. Lego is really interesting here. Obviously, Lego's got its own kind of Toys to Life series. Lego's been kind of like dabbling with this for quite a long time. I'll pass this amongst you because I think this is quite an interesting artifact, partly because it's so destroyed. But that's very early on in the 2000s. It may even be before that. I've yet to really work out when this started. There was Lego started bringing out cameras which could be used for stop frame animation, and this was a tie-in with Steven Spielberg. And the idea was that that children would make their own little kind of animations and post them online. And this is very early on at the beginning of kind of internet culture, and this has become a thing of like people making stop frame animation using Lego. There's an example there, top right hand corner. I don't know if anyone can guess that's a Lego version of Terminator. But there's this whole kind of like culture of remaking classic films or film sequences using Lego in stop frame animation. And of course this ties into the Lego movie, which is a really interesting example of kind of mash-up culture, bringing together all these different franchises. One of the precursors for the Lego series, or the Lego movie, is the Lego series of video games. I don't know how many of you have played any of these, but the first one was the Star Wars video game. In this, you play not as Star Wars characters within the film, you play as the toys, the Lego toys within a kind of Lego world. There's a whole, they've got Star Wars, there's also Lord of the Rings, there's the Lego movie video game, which kind of like, the whole thing becomes full circle. And interesting that the cutscenes in the Lego movie video game are sequences from the Lego movie. So as opposed to remaking sequences, which is what happens when these games kind of remediate existing films, they're actually kind of like transposing the Lego characters from the Lego sequences from the Lego movie. I recently rented there's a Batman Lego movie, which is effectively all the cutscenes from the third Lego Batman video game put together as a film. Which is something I've never seen done before. But again, it suggests a kind of crossover between these different forms of media. Now, obviously, Disney has got. As I said, my focus is on Disney. How much time have I got left?
I think if you want to wind up,
Okay, cool. Obviously, Disney has got a whole tradition of merchandising. Way back in the 1940s, Disney, as a corporation, realised if you put Mickey Mouse toys in the lobby, it tells parents that Mickey Mouse is a safe bet for their kids, as well as kind of like producing extra revenue. And a lot of children's franchises do kind of rely on extra revenue through merchandising in order to be profitable. Forecast talks about synergy, the synergy between the screen media, the theme parks, and the merchandise that's going on within Disney. We've got Jonathan Gray talking about Star Wars, very interesting. Again, like this is part of the Disney series, of the Disney Corporation. We've got kind of the Star Wars toys, the figurines coming out, the action figures coming out with the first film. Gray talks about how the figures, the toys of Star Wars kind of keep the franchise alive in children's homes and in the popular culture imagination, even between films and between franchises, or between different kind of like trilogies. We've also got, Engelhardt talks about this thing, the strawberry shortcake, or the shortcake strategy, which is about films or TV shows. In fact, he's talking particularly about TV shows which are based on pre-existing toys, and My Little Pony is an example of that, also Transformers and He-Man. Again, Pokemon's a really interesting example. Sermon talks about the to-be-heldness of characters within the Pokemon universe, particularly the first generation ones, where you see these figures which almost kind of like look as if they would work very well as toys that children kind of cuddle. And there is some really interesting work about toys and the ways in which they kind of can be considered open objects. That when you get a toy like a Star Wars figure, you can basically do anything you want with this. You can put this character into a whole range of different circumstances. You don't have to play with it as a character from the film. You can create your own narrative. So on the one hand, we can see toys which are based on movie franchises as kind of closed because there are, they have a name, they have a kind of, they have a narrative, they have a backstory, but it isn't necessarily the one which children pick up upon when they start playing with them. And certainly, I remember as a kid playing with toys from a whole range of different franchises and bringing them all together and so forth. So, Toys to Life, really interesting for a whole range of issues. There's kind of issue of re-enchantment, the kind of magic that's at work in this process. It relates to issues around commodification and collecting in children's culture. Also, I talk a bit about the digital divide, how this kind of makes sense as a thing for a parent to buy for a child, because it looks like there's a physicality to it. And bear in mind that a lot of these things are not bought by children, they're bought by parents. It ties into the idea of the thingification of digital media, and also you might say that there is something about controlling play going on here, because of course there isn't very much you can do with these. They don't move, you can't, they're not posable. They are kind of like figurines which are pretty much fixed. They only become usable as toys when you put them into the video game, and within that you're kind of bounded by the rules of the particular environment. Unfortunately, yes, Disney Infinity has been cancelled, so it has come to an end. So I'm still trying to work out what went wrong here, but clearly this whole process of synergy isn't entirely, it doesn't necessarily work. There are various kind of reasons why Disney Infinity has ended. The other franchises in the Toys to Life series seem to be still going strong, but there seems to have been some kind of mistake or something gone wrong with the Disney Infinity franchise. So I may start now working on Lego, because I think Lego seems to be a much more interesting manifestation of this particular trend in video games. Great, thank you very much.
So this paper is based on research that I've conducted for my PhD, and I'm looking here at a selection of tweets surrounding a South African television drama called Intersections, which is an educational TV drama which was made with the aim of raising awareness about HIV and AIDS in South Africa. It was first broadcast in 2009-2010, and it was one of the first educational television dramas in South Africa that triggered a wave of debate on social media, particularly on Twitter and Facebook. But I'm just looking at Twitter here in this paper. So I've analysed a selection of tweets that occurred during and shortly after the broadcast with the aim of exploring the kinds of discourses that viewers' comments have brought to life within digital spaces. And the findings of my analysis suggest that some of the narratives that emerged on Twitter challenged and sometimes mocked the intentions of the producers to educate about HIV and AIDS and to instill fear in viewers. But at the same time, viewers' engagements with Intersections also gave rise to discriminating ideas concerning women and gender. So that's that's in a nutshell. And with this little case study, I'm exploring here the theoretical idea that, or the tentative idea that social media can be described via the concept of unofficial cultures. It's a term that has gained popularity among scholars of popular culture in African contexts since the 1980s, for example, Karen Barber or Dina Ligaga more recently. Basically, these scholars have suggested that forms of popular culture in Africa can carve out spaces for ordinary people to articulate and circulate narratives, opinions, and desires that usually remain invisible in cultural forms or media produced by elites. For example, Ligaga argues that digital media, particularly the internet, can be regarded as spaces where unofficial cultures come to life. So she looks at the Kenyan logosphere in her work and argues that through blogs, Kenyans articulate opinions and desires that often remain hidden from elite-owned and circulated media. So it paints a very optimistic picture of digital spaces and enabling almost, you know, a more inclusive or more democratic production of cultural forms. And I want to take that on critically as well. So, and for the purpose of the paper, I think I just need to very briefly map how the digital media environment and also the social context within which this television program, Intersections, is or was embedded. So digital media in South Africa are not as widely accessible to people as they are in the UK or in Europe, and especially not in poor and disenfranchised communities in the country. So internet penetration currently stands at just over 60%. So that's one first point. That just suggests that marginalised people are likely to be excluded from the narratives and discussions that emerge on Twitter. But I think we need to remember that South Africa is witnessing a steady increase in internet use and is linked closely to the very exponential rise of mobile phone usage in the country over the past 10 years or so, because in South Africa the majority of people access Twitter and Facebook via their mobile phones, so rather than computers. It's simply cheaper and so it's more widely available. My discussion of these tweets for this television dramas, we also need to remember that South Africa currently has the highest rate of HIV and AIDS in the world. So it's just about, for people between 25 and 49 years, the infection rate is at almost 18%, it's very, very high, which is why there's been a lot of educational drama series about HIV/AIDS being produced in the country. And because I've paid attention to the gender dimension of these tweets here, because it's a gendered disease almost, so young women are particularly vulnerable to contracting it, so this is why I have this gender angle here in this paper. Now, the fact that a lot of people commented on this show, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, on Twitter is very interesting because South Africa's public broadcaster, called SABC, has commissioned a wide range of educational television drama series on this subject of HIV and AIDS since the 1990s. And these programs have often failed to attract the attention of people, on the contrary, because there was such a proliferation of educational dramas addressing HIV and AIDS, a lot of people are now tired of hearing, scary messages about HIV or death or AIDS-related illnesses. Some scholars have argued that there's an AIDS fatigue in the air. So it's intriguing that a lot of people tweeted about intersections despite the education objectives that it had. To explore this question, I want to, before I talk about the tweets, quickly talk about the show or the program itself. So it was made with a young audience in mind. It was produced by two South African television companies called Grizzly for Pictures and Multimedia, with international funding as well. And what they did, they in interviews that I did with them, they said, okay, we are aware that people don't want to hear anything about HIV and AIDS anymore. We're going to make a program that is not educational and not didactic. But what they did, interestingly, is that they embark in a strategy of fear tactics and shock. So the storylines follow psychological fear appeals theory, which suggests that if people perceive a threat in their environment, they will then embrace a behavior to protect them from that threat. So it's quite interesting that they did that. I want to show off this work, just some clips to kind of show you, give you a bit of an idea of the show. So this is the very first episode, and it starts with a woman, you will see her getting ready for her wedding day.
I'm glad you like our strategy. Exactly. No, it's true. Public relations nefuthe kakhulu advertising.
Andifazi njani uyatshata namhlanje?
So your advice budget ifumana Monday ke. And then sidibana nini? Thursday. Thursday's good. Engosi msimovuso. Yawulela. Ntombazana, ushamnje mavuso? Abasananga na?
Amana ke sana lam. As if ukabelo akakuspoil enough.
Something new. Oh, Cherise. So beautiful. Ntombazana must be crying.
Yabona wena sana lam. Uzifumanele. Oh, yena. Wena setle man. It's perfect. But then again, so's your life. Ugh. I hate you. Hi, son. Funny, I can't because I was start up one business course.
Hello? Hi, Amy. Sorry for my emotions. I said, oh, I really love it. Well, I can keep it, Mama. Later. It's not there to be showing something strappy and be lazy. Okay, my love. I'll see you later. Love you. Bye.
Bafowethu, ngizwile ikhalo zenu futhi niyayibuza nje ukuthi aziphelele DJ Bo. Eminyakeni edlule ngathola ukuthi ngine-HIV. Ngaqhubeka nenkani. Qhubeka. Jive. Ngayizama imithi yesintu. Kodwa ayikasebenza. Ngakathola mpilo. Bangitshela ukuthi ama-ARVs azongisiza. Kodwa angangabekezeli. Bafowethu, ngenkathi ngilahla ama-ARVs. Ngilahle impilo yami. Namhlanje sesibhedlela. Agents, nafana, ngilahlitha. Kuphela isikhathi.
You know if manini?
Cherise, wonderful wrong AIDS.
Hayi uthi no befumene even ubani uhlukene.
Yazi ukanixela kalo nanjalo. Nkosi yami ndizawuthini. Ngithini njani? Kuba ndinani into abanokabelo nayo. Andibelieve ngowundenze le nto yazi.
Umoya Jumel. Uzafuneka uyotest. Awukho sure nokunayo.
Cherise, why now?
Uzafuneka emxelela ke sisukabelo. Before nitshade.
So she does do that. So they get married and then they have a big argument. And I'm just showing you the closing scene of that first episode.
Before we discuss your first trimester blood test results,
Andihambe ngilala mna. Onke amadoda endikhe ndalala nawo ndingabala kwisakhe esiyi-1.
it's not only about who you have slept with. What is important is, do you know who your previous lovers have slept with?
So basically, this flows is then repeated at the beginning of each episode, and her HIV status is not revealed. It's almost like the cliffhanger that is common for soap operas. And what happens then that in the second episode, it takes viewers 5 years back in time to the relationship that the bride had with this DJ Mo, who is sick. That shows how he cheated on her with a lot of different women, including one young girl here called Faramelli. And then the third episode kind of follows her and her relationships with different men. So again, 5 years back in time. So what the series does then, it kind of paints every episode that follows unpacks a new sexual relationship, so that it creates this big network of humans basically who are connected unknowingly with each other only through the sexual partners that they've shared without knowing. And then towards the end, everybody almost meets at the funeral of that DJ. So again, there's a very kind of explicit warning of what happens when people are infected with HIV. And the very final episode is interesting as well, because it opens like this with a voiceover. The characters you've met are all my friends. Did you recognize yourself in them? Let me tell you why I love them all so much. I love them how they follow their heart's desire, always searching for that perfect partner, having sex along the way. I love sex. Sex is the power, sex is the mystery. Without sex, we would never meet. And you have to imagine this is kind of a very sort of, sinister male voice. So basically what they did here, that they unpacked this sexual network, having it told by a voiceover which claims to be HIV itself. So there's almost like a personification of that virus, because I don't think I've got time to show you. If I've got time at the end, I'll show you another clip. And then HIV himself explains which characters he infected in the series and which not. So again, the sphere strategy is made very explicit in this final episode, because he makes very ironic comments such as, "Oh, I'm dying to meet you," and something like, "I will give you AIDS and I will kill you," things like that. And I was interested in how people, in these tweets that I looked at, how people responded to this kind of ending and this kind of fear strategy of the producers. So this show received on average about 2,000 mentions on Twitter, which might not sound a lot for here in the UK, but it was a lot in the context of South Africa. And again, these online comments took place at the same time as the show was broadcast, which seemed to have incurred this rise of social TV, which I think is quite a nice term to describe people's engagement with social media at the same time as they're watching television. So I looked at tweets with the hashtag Intersections, and then because there was this large volume, I just looked at tweets shortly shortly after episodes that were thematically relevant to my interest, and I'm looking at youth and gender here. So again, I've only been able to look at a small selection of the large number of tweets that were available. And what I found was that many viewers' responses to Intersection on Twitter kind of reiterated this the fear that was constructed in the diegetic world of intersections. In particularly this last episode, which is narrated by HIV, seemed to have provoked and shocked viewers. So there's some examples. V, so they call it V, V's voice scared, reached out of me, or now I'm going to bed with the voice of HIV in my head. Thanks, Intersection, now I keep hearing the voice of HIV narrating in my life. So that was one side of the story, but then there were also people who kind of were very ironic and kind of mocked this kind of, the intentions of the producer, and turned them into jokes and irony. For example, during this whole intersection does not one of the people thinks of using a condom. DJ Mode is like 5 years old, it's just because his friend is quite short. The scene is 5 years ago, but we see a modern phone. So again, there was this kind of joking about the show and seeing how the way in which people engaged with it was very different to the way the producers had envisaged it. And some of these tweets also brought, which was I thought was interesting, brought an aspect to the show that's entirely invisible in Intersections, which is the political dimension of HIV. Because there were comments about President Jacob Zuma, who he was on trial for rape 10 years ago, and then made this controversial comment that he had taken a shower to prevent infection with HIV. And to finish up, one thing I need to say is the gender dimension of these tweets. Because what is interesting is that from the way the narrative is set up, is that one major theme that emerged from the tweets was that many viewers blamed the female characters of the show for infecting the male characters with HIV or for being unfaithful to them, although the show, the representations and the narrative structure actually critiques male patriarchal behavior. So the female characters, such as the bride you've seen, were quickly labeled as a Jezebel, which is basically a woman who kind of sleeps around. That's a South African slang. So here, seeing what being a Jezebel leads to, Judge and haha, that's a Jezebel, partying, shot. So it was primarily the female characters and not the male characters who were actually shown to be unfaithful that were blamed for the, that was scrutinized on Twitter, and that what is almost like a reflection of entrenched social attitudes about women in sort of offline spaces in South Africa. But they were also challenged by some tweeters who said, then, okay, wait, girls aren't the only ones to blame. So the HIV blame is on the woman in this country, in this days when men are killing us. So just to conclude, these narratives that emerged on Twitter about intersection suggest that social media cannot celebrate it uncritically as a space that can open up unofficial cultures, because they also allow for the circulation of discriminating narratives. And of course, this kind of study is focused on the tweets only, so one crucial element that I haven't looked at is the identity of audiences. But I think it can however, make a contribution to audience research and looking at the diverse responses to a television program such as Intersections. All right, thank you.
It's quite nice to follow your paper because while you were talking about these ideas of unofficial cultures on social media, I'm thinking more in terms of community through social media and the narration of a communal subject. I'm afraid my paper is going to be a bit more traditional than the two I'm following. I'm just going to kind of read through it. I don't have a lot of visuals. It's also going to come from a very different discipline. Since what I do is primarily kind of group analysis, schizoanalysis, and philosophy. So it's coming from a very different discipline, so I'm going to try to take some time to kind of walk you through some of the theories in case you're not totally familiar with them. What I'd like to do with this paper is kind of briefly sketch out the formation of subjectivity in digital space. And specifically look at how this space may kind of be captured by certain forces of neoliberal capital in order to actually block this formation happening. And then if, at the very end, if I have a bit of time, I'll look at some kind of resistance strategies that could be applied. The theoretical context comes out of a much larger project that I'm working on that's looking at resistance in the work of Georges Bataille, Gilles Deleuze, and Felix Guattari. Initially, I was going to kind of focus on all three theorists in this paper, but due to time constraints, poor Bataille had to be written out of it. Although I'd be happy to discuss him during questions or anything like that, and his ideas of community. For those of you who, again, since this is from a slightly different discipline, I thought I'd take a bit of time to give context. For those who are not really familiar with the work of Deleuze and Guattari, they co-authored a series of books together entitled Capitalism and Schizophrenia, as well as a book on Kafka and a book on kind of philosophy, like what is philosophy is the title of their last co-authored book. They also have a quite extensive, especially Deleuze has a very extensive publishing record by himself. And Guattari went on, the first thing he published was Anti-Oedipus with Deleuze, but then went on to publish quite prolifically as well. Together, well, mainly Guattari came up with this idea of schizoanalysis as the kind of jumping off from psychoanalysis. So when I reference schizoanalysis, that's a concept that the two of them formed together. Ostensibly, this as a kind of psychosocial political concept works at two different but related poles. You have an analytic pole, and the point of that is to kind of diagnose what's going on in certain unconscious flows that make people love power to the repression and alienation of all other forms of life. And the second would be a pole of a resistance philosophy to this that works at a, what they termed a micro-political level. That would be the level kind of underneath ideology, the level of kind of unconscious flows. So they're not talking about kind of big grand ideas of like, oh, let's just grab a flag and storm a barricade. They're much more interested in kind of micro processes of control and resistance to that. Which is where a lot of my own work comes out of, especially since I'm also trained to be a therapist. To kind of give a starting off point, it's also important to think about how they, the main preoccupation that both Deleuze and Guattari had, Guattari especially, was the formation of subjectivity. So again, guessing that many people here may not be avid readers of Deleuze and Guattari, although you totally should be. The way that Deleuze and Guattari write about subjectivity is kind of important to give context to this. They basically say subjectivity is formed in the wake of desire. Whereas, say, Lacan talks about desire as lack, it's an absence that we're trying to fill. Deleuze and Guattari are much more interested in this idea of a fullness of desire. In fact, desire is something that's always immanent to a subject and flowing through them. And it's always communally articulated. So, say, a practical example would be, I'm tired of this precarious life. I'm tired of, the precarity of, say, 21st century London. And this kind of gives rise to a certain kind of subjectivity, something that Franco Berardi has named a precariat, rather than the proletariat. So that would be a kind of communal articulation of desire that these subjectivities are formed in the wake of. In this way, desire is always fiercely political. So when you kind of, any articulation of an identity that tries to reduce this, especially within the kind of flows of neoliberalism, is by definition both alienated and at best partial. In fact, one of Deleuze's later essays, Postscript on Societies of Control, argues that we can no longer talk about individuals, that people have been reduced to a mere dividual, lacking any sort of agency or subjectivity. It's just a person in debt, just a person who has monetized value. So that's a very important concept I'm going to return to later. But now to kind of jump off, what would be digital space in terms of Deleuze and Guattari? And this is something really interesting since both of them passed away in the 90s, right at the kind of beginning of the internet age. And both of them had very prolific writings on this kind of beginning phase. But there's a tension there between Deleuze and Guattari. Basically, the kind of misconception is that Deleuze was very suspicious of the rise of the internet and digital telecommunication. He saw this as something that would control people, a controlling apparatus. Whereas Guattari was like, no, this is great, radical potentials, this is going to be a new line of flight, we can move off into all these kind of emancipatory projects through this. However, and this is really my project, I think a close reading of both of their later texts actually can bring a much more nuanced approach to a kind of schizoanalytic understanding of the digital. Something that really needs to be done. And it's especially important because Deleuze is often credited, quite rightly so in some ways, as being a philosopher of the analog, not of the digital. Deleuze kind of said, the digital is nothing but the reduction to binaries. It's the reduction to ones and zeros. However, when contemporary thinkers talk about Deleuze being just a philosopher of the analog, I think this is a form of periodization that is really kind of incorrect. It's trying to historicize Deleuze too much. And it's not really looking at what's happened in kind of digital telecommunications since he died. And if we were to update this, then we have to really start thinking of Deleuze as a philosopher of the digital as well. Guattari, however, in many ways, his work definitely prefigured the turn philosophy would need to take to accommodate for the role of computers and the World Wide Web. It was the pirate radio stations, especially the Italian automist station, Radio Alice, in the 1970s, that had the most significant role in forming Guattari's concept of what he referred to as machinic subjectivities. When commenting on the impact this had for Guattari, his friend, as well as a fellow theorist and activist, Franco Berardi, commented that, this is a quote, I read a long quote, pressed by the diffusion of electronic communication technologies, and in particular, the Minitel experience that became prevalent in France during the 1980s and represented the first example of European telematic network, Felix managed to speak about the post-Mediac civilization starting to appear on the horizon. This would be a civilization in which communication flows are no longer directed from above towards a passive public, but instead function as the dense framework for rhizomatic, that's moving in all directions, exchanges through emitters situated on the same plane. That would be a kind of horizontal kind of idea. Thanks to the free radios, it was possible to understand for the first time a principle that the internet has propagated. The network diffusion of communications that the privileged plane of the social self-organization. So a network of diffuse communications that's all on the same plane. It's inherently egalitarian. Also, just to kind of give this context, do you know what the Minitel project was? Are you familiar with that? That was basically the first World Wide Web. That prefigured www. In France, there was a kind of series of these dial-up connections through a modem, a telephone connection. And it was interesting, because first, obviously, it was for banking. Second, obviously, people were like, oh, we can find porn here, or share sexual exploits, because that's apparently what the internet's best at. But it's also, this became prolific in France in '82. And it started in 1980. It was discontinued finally in 2012. But in '86, there was a student general strike across France organized exclusively through the Minitel systems. So this is something that Guattari saw. It was like, this is a great emancipatory tool. And this is a new series of networks that we can start using in the course of liberation. And that's why he was such, in many ways, kind of a techno-futurist from this point on. Or at least that's how history is often narrated to him. And it's this understanding of telecommunication that was explicitly brought into his collaboration with Deleuze, or in this understanding that he brought into his collaborations with Deleuze. We see that digital space, as constituted through computational networks, becomes very close to the schizoanalytic understanding of what they term the virtual. those kind of familiar with the work of Deleuze and Guattari know that movement, that the way they characterize movement happens between two axiomatic poles. On one hand, you have what they refer to as the virtual. This would be a kind of infinite space of possibilities. It's kind of smoothed over space. Deleuze especially was a big reader of Spinoza, so his idea of universal substance is really brought in here. So it's an infinitely smooth space of possibilities. And then you have the actual, which is this kind of real, phenomenal world. And it's the kind of toggling between the two. So you have this idea of possibility, you stake it out, and it becomes segmented. You form these kind of lines that crisscross it as you experiment with different actualizations of the possibilities. And this changes the movement. So it's not teleological, it's not going in one direction. It's kind of messy, what they refer to as rhizomatic, moving at all points at all times, decentered. So virtual space, and this is quite important. In their early writings, like in Anti-Oedipus, virtual space seemed to be this really kind of amazing radical space where everything's possible, let's go have a revolution. But really, especially if you read their later work in like Thousand Plateaus, it's really value neutral. This idea of having these spaces become absolutely reduced in their value. I think I just scared two students from coming in. They looked at me like, no, God, no. So it's ostensibly value neutral. In fact, they even write, one group's kind of radical project can actually really harm other groups. So it's something that we always take with caution. So both of these spaces are kind of valueless. The only value that they have is in how we utilize them. In fact, this is why they have this kind of radical term, the line of flight, that they developed in Anti-Oedipus, that they totally abandoned that because of this problems that they saw occurring within the virtual, and they only talked about movement, and that was Deleuze or Guattari started talking about cycles. The virtual space becomes very kind of analogous to digital space insofar as they're both infinitely expansive areas defined not by their borders, but rather by intensities that populate the area. In other words, both of these become negative space, or a void. And this is, again, the great difference between, say, psychoanalysis and schizoanalysis. We cannot understand a void as lack or absence. A void is, and this is a quote from Deleuze, fully part of the constitution of the field of desire, crisscrossed by particles and fluxes. So it's not an absence, but the constitutive space of desire, where different singularities, different subjects, if you like, can come into contact with each other and kind of form these new communal assemblages, or ensembles is another translation. One thing that I like to use when I think about this is in Japanese architecture. There's the word for void is ma, and the word for architecture is ken. But yet when you write it, they're both represented by the same character. And that's, again, Guattari traveled much to Japan. He was very interested in Japanese architecture. And because of, that's why he had this interest in Japanese architecture. Void is not understood as an absence, but rather a space of possibility. This is where you make the construction, is in the void. This is where things can happen. So it's not like any kind of lack. And if we're going to expand this to digital space, especially like moving on from the mid-trend to the World Wide Web, we're no longer confined by any kind of geopolitical borders. It's absolutely expansive. Who we can connect to, the different subjectivities that can enter into this space. Well, people like Franco Berardi, a lot of the people kind of loosely grouped as accelerationists over at Goldsmith and Mark Fisher and others, they might argue that Guattari was the precursor to a kind of libertarian cyberculture, I think it's an error to view his thoughts on the kind of emancipatory potentials of digital space as the binary positive to Deleuze's negative. Both Deleuze and Guattari argued that neoliberal capitalism has moved beyond disciplined societies, from what Foucault talked about, societies in enclosed spaces, to societies of control, where the subjects are cut off from communal practices and reduced to isolated individuals, alienated subjects in debt. What Deleuze and Guattari were beginning to articulate in both of their later writings, again, independent of each other, was the image of subjectivity through a new trope that Deleuze referred to as the superfold. Now, this recognizes the computer as the central mitigating factor in the formation of subjectivity. That means we can no longer think of the self without thinking in some terms of a computational network. Whereas the fold was Deleuze's diagram for the modern subject of the Baroque period coming into relationship with itself, the superfold is a new active mechanism for life within a computerized control society where the human comes into relation with forces from the outside, such as the silicon of the computer chip, or other extraneous factors from genetic engineering. Like this is where in the 90s you started getting a lot of writing about cyborg. This is cyborg culture with people like Nick Land and Critical Art Ensemble. A lot of this was looking at kind of Deleuze's later writings. Now for Guattari, the most illustrative example of this kind of new controlled society was architecture. And not necessarily the architecture of cities, but the architecture of these virtual spaces, kind of virtual and digital spaces. He argued that cyber capitalism's reorganization of digital space affects human facilities such as memory, perception, understanding, and imagination in order to prevent the formation of any kind of collective subject. This form of atomization is most active exactly when we actually think we're within a community. So what this basically means is that the kind of so-called online communities of social networking sites like Instagram, or especially I would say YouTube, are by their very nature false, insofar as they lack any kind of true forms of communication or communion. With something like Instagram, basically what we have is this kind of series of alienated images, right? Facebook is something similar. It's just all these alienated images cut off from any wider context. So while we may think, like, yeah, we're communicating with person X, because I know that they were out drinking last night, I know that they got married, had a baby, maybe in that exact order, in fact, depending on their site, I don't know. But yet, the juxtaposition with that, with other kind of alienated images, articles, status updates, kind of causes a certain block in communication. It creates a juxtaposition of context that gives a different understanding. And just in one more second, one thing I think is most prevalent then it would be a community like the YouTube vloggers, right? Whilst that may seem like a very traditional society organized around a head, and an elective community no less, since you kind of choose who to follow, there you have the absolute reduction of life to its monetary exchange value. Vloggers make their living quite literally by monetizing their life. The people who follow the vloggers, the people in these communities, their value is reduced merely to their ability to like something. Or to kind of click the play button, really. So here we have the absolute reduction of life to a mere idea of exchange. Communication doesn't happen because of this kind of blockage of the exchange value. All we have is a monetary exchange value. Communication doesn't happen even when a vlogger is kind of waxing nostalgic about their new girlfriend, or their, I don't know whatever they wax nostalgic about, or hopeful about. The fact that it's reduced to this kind of monetary value puts into a certain mediation that reduces them from subjects. All they are, their wedding, their partner, their relationships, all these are pure fantasy. It's a fetishized commodities. they are reduced to just individuals, that they no longer lack any kind of agency or subjectivity. And if I had more time, I would talk about maybe some potential out of that, but unfortunately, I do not. So thanks.